Commander Takeo Shibata stood on the bridge of the Japanese submarine I-36, his binoculars trained on the horizon. It was the afternoon of November 10, 1944, and his vessel had been running submerged for most of the previous 72 hours, creeping toward the massive American anchorage at Ulithi Atoll in the Caroline Islands. Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters had ordered reconnaissance of the enemy fleet concentration. They needed to know what the Americans had assembled for their next offensive. Shibata had expected to find perhaps 8 to 10 carriers, possibly a dozen if intelligence estimates were wrong. What he saw through his optics made him lower the binoculars, blink, and look again. The lagoon stretched before him, and it was filled with aircraft carriers. Not the handful he expected, not even twice that number. He began counting systematically, left to right across the anchorage. Essex-class fleet carriers, their massive flight decks unmistakable, even at this distance. Independence-class light carriers, converted from cruiser hulls, smaller but still formidable. He counted slowly, carefully, marking each vessel in his mind. 8 carriers, 10, 15, 20. He kept counting. 25, 26, 27 visible carriers, and his submarine's position did not allow him to see the entire anchorage. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Shibata had fought at Midway in June 1942, where Japan lost 4 fleet carriers in a single day. He had witnessed the gradual attrition of Japanese naval aviation through 1943 and into 1944. He knew, intellectually, that American industrial capacity exceeded Japan's. But knowing it as an abstract fact and seeing it manifested in a lagoon filled with more carriers than Japan had built in its entire naval history were different experiences entirely. He ordered his executive officer to verify the count. The younger man raised his own binoculars and began the same systematic process. Several minutes passed in silence, except for the gentle lap of water against the submarine's hull and the distant sounds of activity from the American fleet. 27 carriers confirmed. Commander, the executive officer said quietly. There may be more beyond our line of sight. Shibata nodded slowly. He had been at sea since 1937, fighting in China, then across the Pacific. He had believed, as every officer in the Imperial Navy believed, that superior training, superior tactics, and superior fighting spirit could compensate for America's industrial advantages. The IJN had developed the world's finest naval aviation before the war. Japanese pilots had more combat experience than any in the world. Japanese torpedoes were superior. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized aggressive action and decisive battle. These advantages had carried them through the early months of the war, from Pearl Harbor through the Dutch East Indies, from the Indian Ocean to the Coral Sea. But standing on that bridge, looking at 27 aircraft carriers riding at anchor in an enemy lagoon, Shibata understood something that many of his fellow officers would not grasp for months to come. The mathematics of the war had never favored Japan. The nation that could assemble 27 carriers in a single anchorage, that could afford to concentrate such overwhelming power in one location while simultaneously fighting a naval war across the entire Pacific and supporting major operations in the Atlantic, was not an enemy that could be defeated by training or spirit or tactical excellence. This was industrial warfare on a scale Japan had never prepared for, could never match, and could not survive. The confidence Shibata and his fellow officers felt had not emerged from nowhere. It was built on a foundation of genuine achievement, careful planning, and years of success. The Imperial Japanese Navy of 1941 was, by any objective measure, one of the finest naval forces in human history. Its carrier aviation was unmatched. Its surface combatants were among the most capable in the world. Its officer corps was highly trained and thoroughly professional. Japan had committed to carrier aviation earlier and more thoroughly than any other nation. While the United States and Britain maintained battleship-centric naval doctrines well into the 1930s, Japan had begun building its naval strategy around carrier-based air power. The Akagi and Kaga, converted from battleship and battlecruiser hulls respectively, gave Japan practical experience with large deck carrier operations years before most nations took the concept seriously. The Soryu and Hiryu, purpose-built fleet carriers commissioned in the late 1930s, incorporated lessons learned from operating the earlier conversions. By 1941, Japan possessed 10 aircraft carriers of various types. More importantly, it had developed a coordinated carrier strike doctrine that no other navy could match. Japanese carrier air groups trained together constantly. Pilots practiced massed deck launches, coordinated attacks, and complex navigation over open ocean. The level of preparation was extraordinary. Pilots assigned to carrier air groups typically had over 800 hours of flight time before their first combat mission. Many had combat experience from the war in China that had been raging since 1937. The aircraft themselves represented the cutting edge of naval aviation design. The Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighter, introduced to combat in China in 1940, outperformed every fighter it encountered. It was faster, more maneuverable, and had longer range than American or British fighters of the same period. The Nakajima B-5N torpedo bomber, called Kate by Allied forces, was a reliable, effective strike aircraft with excellent range. The Aichi D-3A dive bomber, VAL in Allied nomenclature, was accurate and capable. These aircraft, flown by highly trained pilots and operating from well-designed carriers, made the Japanese carrier force the most formidable naval aviation arm in the world. Japanese naval strategy for war against the United States had been refined over decades. The assumption was that America, if it chose to fight, would send its Pacific Fleet westward across the ocean to relieve the Philippines and engage the Japanese fleet. This advancing American fleet would be subjected to attrition by submarines, then attacked by land-based naval aviation as it approached Japanese-controlled waters, and finally engaged in a decisive surface battle where superior Japanese training and night-fighting capability would prove decisive. The plan envisioned destroying enough American capital ships in this decisive battle to force a negotiated peace, before American industrial capacity could fully mobilize. This strategy was not foolish or irrational, given the information available to Japanese planners. They understood that American industrial capacity exceeded Japan's. They knew a prolonged war favored the United States. But they believed, reasonably based on their experiences and observations, that a swift, decisive campaign could achieve their objectives before American production reached full capacity. The attack on Pearl Harbor was designed to delay American response, buying time for Japan to consolidate its holdings in Southeast Asia and establish a defensive perimeter that would be too costly for America to breach. The early results seemed to validate this strategy completely. Pearl Harbor inflicted devastating damage on the American Pacific Fleet, sinking or damaging 8 battleships and eliminating American battleship strength in the Pacific for months. Japanese forces swept across Southeast Asia, conquering the PERD, Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and Burma in a campaign that lasted just 5 months. British, American, and Dutch forces were defeated everywhere they stood and fought. Japanese carrier aviation proved itself repeatedly, sinking the British battleship HMS Prince of Wales and battlecruiser HMS Repulse off Malaya, supporting amphibious operations across thousands of miles of ocean and dominating the air over every battlefield. Japanese confidence in their naval power rested on more than just equipment and training. It was rooted in a particular understanding of naval warfare that had been developed over decades of study, planning, and practice. This understanding emphasized quality over quantity, decisive battle over attrition, and the belief that superior skill and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages. The historical example that shaped Japanese naval thinking was the Battle of Tsushima in May 1905, where Admiral Heihachiro Togo's fleet destroyed a Russian naval squadron in one of the most decisive naval victories in modern history. Japan, a smaller nation with limited industrial capacity, had defeated a major European power through superior training, better tactics, and aggressive execution. The lesson drawn from Tsushima was that a smaller but better trained and better led force could defeat a larger enemy through decisive action at the critical moment. This philosophy permeated every aspect of Japanese naval development. Rather than attempting to match potential enemies ship for ship, Japan focused on building a smaller number of superior vessels manned by highly trained crews. Japanese destroyers were larger, faster, and more heavily armed than their American counterparts. Japanese cruisers carried the Type 93 torpedo, a 24-inch oxygen-fueled weapon with a range of over 22 miles at high speed, far exceeding anything in Western arsenals. Japanese battleships, while fewer in number than those of potential enemies, were individually powerful and well-designed. The same philosophy applied to naval aviation. Rather than building large numbers of adequate aircraft and training sufficient pilots, Japan built excellent aircraft and trained a relatively small number of pilots to an extraordinarily high standard. The pre-war training program for carrier pilots was rigorous to the point of being wasteful. Many candidates washed out. Those who succeeded were among the finest naval aviators in the world, but there were not many of them. The entire pre-war system was predicated on fighting a short, decisive war where this elite force would achieve victory before attrition became a factor. Japanese naval officers understood that their nation's industrial capacity was limited compared to the United States. Japan's steel production in 1941 was approximately 7 million tons annually. American steel production that same year exceeded 80 million tons. Japan had no domestic sources of petroleum, depending entirely on imports from the Dutch East Indies, which it did not control until after war began. The United States produced over 60% of the world's petroleum from domestic sources. Japan's shipbuilding capacity, while modern and efficient, was a fraction of America's. But Japanese planners believed these disadvantages could be overcome through strategic surprise, tactical excellence, and achieving decisive results before American industry fully mobilized. They assumed the war would be short, measured in months rather than years. They assumed American public opinion would not support a prolonged, costly war to reconquer distant territories. They assumed that capturing resource-rich areas like the Dutch East Indies and securing a defensive perimeter across the Pacific would create a situation where continued American offensive action would be too expensive to sustain. These assumptions were not baseless. They were built on observations of American politics, assessments of American public opinion after World War I, and calculations about how much treasure and blood America would spend to recover territories like the Philippines. What Japanese planners failed to adequately account for was the transformation that American industry could undergo when fully mobilized for total war, and the determination that would follow the shock of Pearl Harbor. By late 1944, when Commander Shibata's submarine approached Ulithi, the entire foundation of Japanese naval strategy had been systematically demolished. But understanding how that happened requires understanding not just the battles, but the industrial and production systems that supported them, and the profound difference in scale between what Japan could build and what America built. The aircraft carriers Commander Shibata observed at Ulithi represented something unprecedented in naval history: the complete industrialization of naval warfare. Every carrier in prayers, that anchorage told a story about American production capacity that Japanese planners had failed to comprehend, even as they acknowledged American industrial superiority in the abstract. The Essex-class fleet carriers that dominated the anchorage were products of a construction program that began in 1942. These were not converted battleships or cruisers, not experimental designs or one-off prototypes. They were mass-produced warships, built to a standardized design across multiple shipyards, using techniques borrowed from commercial shipbuilding and adapted for naval construction. Each Essex-class carrier displaced 27,000 tons, measured 872 feet long, and carried an air group of over 90 aircraft. They were fast, capable of 33 knots, and their armor, protection, and damage control systems were superior to Japanese carriers. Newport News, shipbuilding and dry dock company in Virginia, laid down the first Essex-class carrier in April 1941, 7 months before Pearl Harbor. The ship was commissioned in December 1942. By the time Commander Shibata's submarine reached Ulithi in November 1944, 17 Essex-class carriers had been commissioned, with more under construction. The United States was completing an Essex-class fleet carrier every 2 to 3 months during the peak production period. The process of building these ships revealed the depth of American industrial mobilization. Bethlehem Steel's shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts, built 4 Essex-class carriers. Brooklyn Navy Yard built 3. Norfolk Navy Yard built 2. Philadelphia Navy Yard built 2. Newport News built 8. Each yard employed tens of thousands of workers operating around the clock in 3 shifts. The workforce included large numbers of women, many of whom had never worked in heavy industry before the war, but who learned to weld, rivet, and assemble complex machinery with remarkable speed. The shipyards themselves were marvels of organization. At Newport News, the construction process for an Essex-class carrier involved coordinating deliveries from hundreds of subcontractors, producing everything from propeller shafts to radar antennas to mess hall equipment. Steel plate arrived from mills in Pennsylvania. Turbines came from General Electric facilities in New York. Boilers were manufactured in Indiana. Radar systems came from factories in New Jersey. Hundreds of tons of material flowed into each shipyard daily, organized by a logistics system that could track thousands of components and ensure they arrived at the right place at the right time. The keel for an Essex-class carrier was typically laid in a dry dock, where the bottom structure of the ship was assembled on massive wooden blocks. Workers installed the keel plates, the frames that would give the ship its shape, and the bottom plating. Once the basic bottom structure was complete, the ship's double bottom, a safety feature that provided protection against torpedoes and mines, was installed. The inner bottom plating created a space between the outer hull and the inner hull that could be flooded for ballast or used for fuel storage. As construction progressed upward, workers installed the machinery spaces where the carrier's 8 boilers and 4 turbines would generate the 150,000 horsepower needed to drive the ship at full speed. The hangar deck, where aircraft would be maintained and armed, was assembled with overhead roller systems that allowed planes to be moved efficiently. The flight deck, measuring over 800 feet long and nearly 100 feet wide, was constructed from steel plate strong enough to support aircraft weighing several tons landing at high speed. The island structure, rising from the starboard side of the flight deck, housed the bridge, flight control positions, and radar equipment. Multiple gun mounts were installed around the flight deck perimeter, giving the carrier defensive capability against air attack. These included 5-inch dual-purpose guns that could engage both surface and air targets, 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft guns in quadruple mounts, and 20mm Oerlikon cannons for close-range defense. The timeline from keel laying to commissioning for an Essex-class carrier averaged about 18 to 20 months during wartime production. Some ships were completed faster when yard workers became experienced with the design and when material deliveries were uninterrupted. This was extraordinary speed for vessels of such complexity and size. For comparison, Japanese fleet carriers typically required 3 to 4 years from keel laying to commissioning, and Japan's shipyard capacity was far more limited. Beyond the Essex-class fleet carriers, the United States also produced 9 Independence-class light carriers during the war. These were converted from Cleveland-class light cruiser hulls already, under construction, when the need for additional carriers became apparent after Midway. The conversion process was faster than building fleet carriers from scratch, and while these light carriers were smaller, carrying only 30 to 35 aircraft compared to 90+ on fleet carriers, they added crucial capability to the fleet. Several of these light carriers were visible at Ulithi alongside their larger Essex-class cousins. The stark contrast between American and Japanese carrier construction illustrated the fundamental disparity in industrial capacity that would determine the war's outcome. While the United States was commissioning fleet carriers every few months, Japan's carrier construction program during the war years was minimal and constrained by resource limitations, shipyard capacity, and strategic decisions that prioritized other vessel types. Japan entered the war with 10 aircraft carriers. The fleet carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, plus 4 smaller carriers. This was a respectable force, arguably the finest carrier aviation force in the world in terms of training and doctrine. But Japan's ability to replace losses or expand this force during wartime was severely limited. Japanese shipyards had built the fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku in the late 1930s. These were excellent ships, well designed with good armor protection and capable of carrying substantial air groups. They displaced 25,000 tons and could make 34 knots. They were, by most measures, comparable to or better than American carriers of the same era. But building them had required 3 years from keel laying to commissioning, and Japan's industrial capacity made it impossible to produce such ships quickly or in large numbers during wartime. After Pearl Harbor, Japan began construction on exactly 3 fleet carriers during the entire course of the war. Taiho, commissioned in March 1944, Shinano, converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull and commissioned in November 1944, and Unryu, commissioned in August 1944. 3 fleet carriers in nearly 4 years of war, compared to 17 Essex-class carriers commissioned by the United States in roughly the same period. The numbers tell the story of industrial disparity, but the details reveal why this disparity existed. Japanese shipyards were smaller than their American counterparts and less mechanized. Where American yards used electric cranes, conveyor systems, and prefabrication techniques that allowed sections of ships to be built separately and then assembled, Japanese yards relied more heavily on traditional shipbuilding methods, with greater manual labor and less automation. Resource constraints affected every aspect of Japanese naval construction. Steel allocation for shipbuilding competed with steel needed for merchant shipping, for aircraft production, for ammunition, and for maintaining the existing fleet. Japan's steel production remained relatively constant throughout the war, at around 7 to 8 million tons annually, while American steel production exceeded 90 million tons per year by 1944. This disparity meant that every Japanese construction decision involved difficult trade-offs. Moreover, Japan's strategic situation forced the Navy to prioritize vessel types other than carriers. Merchant shipping losses to American submarines created desperate need for escort vessels to protect convoys. Destroyers and destroyer escorts consumed shipyard capacity. Submarine construction, though never prioritized as highly as it should have been, took resources. Battleship and cruiser construction continued even after it became clear that carrier aviation dominated naval warfare. The massive battleships, Yamato and Musashi, completed before and during the war, represented enormous investments in ships that saw limited action and proved strategically irrelevant. The carrier Shinano, which was converted from the 3rd Yamato-class battleship hull, illustrated both Japanese engineering capability and the resource constraints they faced. At 72,000 tons fully loaded, Shinano was the largest aircraft carrier built during World War II. But converting the battleship hull to a carrier took years, consumed scarce resources, and produced a ship that was commissioned only in November 1944. Shinano was sunk by the American submarine USS Archerfish just 10 days after commissioning, on her maiden voyage, having never launched an aircraft in combat. The enormous investment in this single ship yielded no operational benefit. Japan did produce several smaller carriers during the war by converting other vessels. The Hyo and Junyo were converted from luxury liner hulls. The Chitose and Chiyoda were converted from seaplane tenders. The Ryuho was converted from a submarine tender. These conversions added some carrier capacity, but were compromises, producing ships that were slower, less capable, and more vulnerable than purpose-built fleet carriers. By late 1944, most of these converted carriers had been sunk. The pilot training bottleneck compounded Japan's carrier problems. Even if Japan had possessed more carriers, the trained pilots to fly from them did not exist. The pre-war Japanese naval aviation training system produced highly skilled pilots, but in small numbers and at great expense in time and fuel. When losses mounted at Midway, in the Solomons campaign, and during the fighting around Rabaul and New Guinea, Japan could not replace experienced pilots quickly enough. The training pipeline was too narrow, fuel for training was increasingly scarce, and the quality of replacement pilots declined steadily through 1943 and 1944. By the time of the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by American pilots, Japanese carrier air groups were filled with inexperienced aviators who had received perhaps a third of the training that pre-war pilots had received. These poorly trained pilots, flying against experienced American aviators in aircraft that were no longer superior, resulted in catastrophic losses. Japan lost over 400 aircraft and 3 carriers in that battle, effectively destroying Japanese carrier aviation as an effective fighting force. Commander Shibata's submarine I-36 remained submerged near Ulithi for several hours, observing the American fleet and taking photographs through the periscope. The intelligence this reconnaissance would provide was valuable, but Shibata already understood the essential truth. The war was mathematically unwinnable. The fleet assembled at Ulithi represented more carrier striking power than Japan had possessed at the height of its strength, and this was merely one concentration of American naval power, not the entirety of it. Other American carriers were operating off the Philippines, supporting the landings at Leyte. Still, others were refitting in American ports, their crews on leave while ships received maintenance and upgrades. Fast carrier task forces that had struck targets across the Pacific were rotating through rear areas, demonstrating a logistical system that could sustain continuous offensive operations. The United States Navy had achieved something unprecedented: the ability to maintain multiple independent carrier task forces operating simultaneously across an ocean spanning thousands of miles. The Japanese Navy at this same moment had functionally 0 operational fleet carriers. The Zuikaku, last survivor of the 6 fleet carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor, would be sunk at the Battle of Leyte Gulf later that month. The few remaining carriers were held back, unable to operate because they had no trained air groups to fly from them. A carrier without aircraft is simply a very expensive, very vulnerable ship with no offensive capability. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Shibata had the submarine's communications officer encode a detailed report of the reconnaissance. The message would be transmitted once the submarine withdrew to a safe distance from the American fleet. The report would reach Combined Fleet Headquarters, where staff officers would analyze the information and brief senior commanders. But what could those commanders do with the information? Launch an attack? With what aircraft? From what carriers? The Imperial Navy no longer possessed the capability to meaningfully threaten a fleet of this size. The submarine withdrew carefully, maintaining depth to avoid detection by American destroyer patrols. As the distance from Ulithi increased and the submarine reached safer waters, Shibata ordered the communications officer to transmit reconnaissance report. The message included the carrier count, estimates of other vessel types observed, and assessment of the anchorage's defensive preparations. The transmission was brief, encoded, and sent in a burst to minimize the chance of American direction-finding equipment locating the submarine. In the days following this reconnaissance, Japanese intelligence officers compiled reports from multiple sources, attempting to understand the full scope of American carrier strength. Submarine reconnaissance provided some information. Signals intelligence, though American communications security was generally good, provided fragments of data. Reports from Japanese garrisons on bypassed islands occasionally included sightings of American task forces. Photo reconnaissance from the few remaining long-range aircraft provided some visual confirmation. The picture that emerged was overwhelming. American carrier task groups operated with apparent impunity across the Western Pacific. Fast, carrier forces struck targets from the Philippines to Taiwan to the Japanese home islands themselves. The mobility and striking power of these task forces made them nearly impossible to counter. Japanese land-based aviation, trying to defend against carrier raids, was systematically destroyed. The few times Japanese aircraft managed to strike American carriers, the ships survived damage that would have sunk Japanese carriers due to superior damage control training and design features like armored flight decks on some vessels. Japanese naval officers who saw these intelligence reports and understood their implications faced a psychological crisis. Everything they had been taught, everything they had believed about naval warfare and about Japan's ability to compete with the United States was demonstrably false. The quality advantages that Japanese forces possessed at the war's start had been negated by American learning and adaptation. Japanese torpedoes were still superior in technical terms, but American radar-directed gunnery and superior damage control more than compensated. Japanese night-fighting expertise had mattered early in the war, but American adoption of radar for surface combat eliminated that advantage. Most fundamentally, the industrial disparity was simply too large to overcome. The United States had not just mobilized its existing capacity, it had built entirely new capacity specifically for war production. Shipyards that did not exist in 1941 were launching carriers by 1943. Aircraft factories were producing planes at rates that seemed impossible. The logistics system that supported these forces was itself a marvel that Japan could not replicate. American fleet oilers allowed carriers to remain at sea for weeks without returning to port. Fleet supply vessels brought ammunition, food, spare parts, and mail to ships at sea. Floating dry docks accompanied the fleet, providing repair capability without returning damaged vessels to distant shipyards. The intelligence report from Commander Shibata's reconnaissance of Ulithi reached combined fleet headquarters within days. Staff officers studied the photographs and read the detailed observations with growing concern. 27 carriers confirmed, possibly more beyond the observation point. The implications were discussed in hushed conversations in the staff offices, but no one wanted to present these findings directly to senior command with the obvious conclusion attached. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, received the report during planning for what would become the Battle of Leyte Gulf. He understood what the carrier count meant, but strategic options had narrowed to the point where understanding changed nothing. Japan would commit its remaining surface forces to a desperate attempt to disrupt the American invasion of the Philippines. The plan relied on using the few remaining carriers as decoys to draw American carrier forces away from the landing beaches, allowing Japanese battleships and cruisers to attack the vulnerable invasion fleet. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, fought in late October 1944, was the largest naval battle of the Pacific War and effectively the last. Japan committed nearly every operational warship it possessed. 4 aircraft carriers were sent north as the decoy force: Zuikaku, the last surviving Pearl Harbor veteran, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda. Between them, these 4 carriers embarked only 116 aircraft total, with many pilots so inexperienced they had barely qualified for carrier operations. The carrier's primary purpose was not to launch effective strikes, but simply to be seen, to draw American attention. The decoy worked. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the American Third Fleet with its fast carriers, took the bait and steamed north to engage what he believed was the primary Japanese threat. But even with most American carriers drawn away, the remaining American forces at Leyte Gulf proved more than sufficient to savage the Japanese surface forces. The northern decoy force was decimated, all 4 carriers sunk. The center and southern Japanese forces, attempting to reach the landing beaches, were destroyed piecemeal by American surface forces, submarines, and the carrier aircraft that Halsey eventually sent back south. The Japanese Navy lost 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers at Leyte Gulf. The United States lost 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort. The disparity in losses reflected the disparity in overall strength. Japan had committed everything and lost most of it. The United States had committed a portion of its available forces and suffered manageable losses that would be replaced within months. After Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Some ships remained operational, but fuel shortages kept them in port. The remaining vessels were largely confined to home waters, unable to project power or meaningfully contest American operations. The carrier force that had struck Pearl Harbor, conquered the Pacific, and terrorized Allied naval forces across the Indian Ocean was gone. not defeated in a climactic carrier battle like those in American war planning, but ground down through attrition, unable to replace losses, ultimately made irrelevant by the sheer scale of American production. Commander Shibata's submarine I-36 continued patrols through the final months of 1944 and into 1945. Submarine operations were among the few naval activities Japan could still conduct, though American anti-submarine capabilities had improved dramatically and losses among Japanese submarines were heavy. The information Shibata had gathered at Ulithi was accurate and professionally reported, but it changed nothing. Strategic decisions at that level of the war were not made based on tactical intelligence but on fundamental realities that no amount of better information could alter. The submarine I-36 survived until April 19, 1945, when it was sunk by the American destroyer escort USS Corbusier off Okinawa. Shibata and his crew were lost. The submarine had been attempting to approach the massive American fleet supporting the Okinawa invasion, perhaps hoping to repeat the reconnaissance success at Ulithi, or possibly attempting an attack despite the overwhelming American anti-submarine defenses. The exact circumstances are not fully documented, only that the submarine was detected, attacked with depth charges, and never surfaced. The young executive officer who had confirmed Shibata's carrier count at Ulithi was not aboard 136 when she was lost. He had been transferred to another boat several months earlier. That submarine was sunk in February 1945. Of the approximately 150 Japanese submarines that conducted war patrols during the Pacific War, 129 were lost. The survival rate for Japanese submariners was among the lowest of any combatant branch in any military during World War II. The final accounting of American carrier production during World War II provides the mathematical proof of what Commander Shibata observed at Ulithi. The United States Navy commissioned 99 aircraft carriers of all types during the war years, from 1941 through 1945. This total included fleet carriers, light carriers, and escort carriers. The breakdown reveals the depth of American industrial mobilization. 17 Essex-class fleet carriers were commissioned during the war, with several more completed shortly after war's end. These were the most capable carriers in the world at the time, each able to carry over 90 aircraft and operate at high speed with the fast carrier task forces that dominated the Pacific War's final years. 9 Independence-class light carriers, converted from cruiser hulls, added additional capability. These were smaller and carried fewer aircraft, but their speed allowed them to operate alongside the fleet carriers. The remaining 73 carriers were escort carriers, smaller vessels built on merchant ship hulls and used primarily for convoy escort, submarine hunting, and supporting amphibious operations. While less glamorous than the fleet carriers, these escort carriers freed up the larger carriers for offensive operations and provided air cover for the vital convoy routes that sustained American and Allied forces worldwide. The escort carriers were produced using techniques borrowed directly from merchant shipbuilding, with some vessels completed in as little as 3 months, from keel laying to commissioning. Japan commissioned 17 aircraft carriers of all types during the entire war period. This included fleet carriers, light carriers, and converted vessels. The disparity was not 17 to 99 in absolute numbers, but in capability the difference was far greater. Many Japanese carriers commissioned during the war were conversions from other vessel types, compromises that produced ships less capable than purpose-built carriers. Several were sunk before they could conduct any significant operations. Most of the carriers Japan did commission lacked adequate aircraft and trained pilots to operate effectively. The production numbers extended beyond carriers to every category of naval vessel. The United States commissioned over 300 submarines during the war. These submarines devastated Japanese merchant shipping, sinking over 5 million tons of merchant vessels and strangling Japan's ability to import raw materials and food. Japan commissioned 126 submarines during the same period, but used them primarily for fleet support rather than commerce raiding, a strategic decision that contributed to Japan's eventual defeat. American destroyer production totaled 349 vessels during the war years. These destroyers provided anti-submarine protection, anti-aircraft defense, and surface combat capability for the fleet. Japan produced 63 destroyers. American destroyer escorts, smaller vessels built specifically for convoy escort duties, numbered over 400 commissioned during the war. Japan produced approximately 170 escort vessels of various types, never enough to adequately protect the merchant convoys that supplied the empire. Behind these production numbers stood the industrial infrastructure that made them possible. American shipyards employed over 1 million workers at peak production. The workers included experienced shipbuilders, but also hundreds of thousands of people who had never worked in heavy industry before the war. Training programs brought new workers up to speed quickly. Women, who comprised a significant portion of the workforce, performed welding, riveting, and assembly work that had been exclusively male domains before the war. The steel for these ships came from mills in Pennsylvania, Indiana, Ohio, and Alabama. These mills had expanded dramatically during the war, adding new blast furnaces and rolling mills to meet military demand, while still producing steel for civilian industry. American steel production in 1944 reached 95 million tons, more than Germany, Japan, and all other Axis nations combined. This steel became ships, tanks, artillery pieces, ammunition, and the structures that housed the factories producing war material. The economic mobilization extended to every level. Aluminum production increased sixfold to support aircraft production. Synthetic rubber production replaced natural rubber supplies cut off by Japanese conquest of Southeast Asia. Machine tool production expanded to provide the equipment needed for factories, producing everything from rifles to radios. The scale was unprecedented and has never been matched. The American economy in 1944 was producing war material at a rate greater than all other combatants in the war combined, both Allied and Axis. The recognition that came to Commander Shibata at Ulithi, the mathematical certainty that Japan could not win the war, had arrived too late to change anything. By November 1944, when that submarine periscope broke the surface and counted carriers, Japan had already lost the war in every meaningful sense. The battles that followed, from Leyte Gulf through Iwo Jima and Okinawa to the planned invasion of the home islands that never came, were fought with the outcome predetermined. The irony is that Japanese military and political leadership had understood, abstractly, that American industrial capacity exceeded Japan's before the war began. This understanding informed the strategic decision to strike first, capture resource-rich territories quickly, and establish a defensive perimeter that would be too costly for America to breach. The entire strategy was predicated on avoiding a prolonged industrial war that Japan could not win. But understanding something as an abstract fact differs from confronting the physical reality. Staff officers in Tokyo could read reports about American steel production, study intelligence estimates of American shipbuilding capacity, and intellectually comprehend that the numbers favored the United States. These were statistics, data points in strategic calculations. Standing on a submarine bridge looking at 27 aircraft carriers riding at anchor in a single lagoon was something different entirely. It was visceral, immediate, undeniable proof that the industrial war Japan had tried to avoid was the war it was fighting and losing. The psychological impact of this recognition rippled through Japanese naval forces in the war's final months. Officers who understood what the carrier count at Ulithi meant, who saw the intelligence reports about American production, faced a crisis of purpose. They had trained their entire professional lives for naval warfare, believed in Japan's ultimate victory, trusted their equipment and their doctrine. Now they commanded ships that would never see port again, aircraft that would not return from missions, and submarines that sailed knowing American anti-submarine capabilities made survival unlikely. The response to this recognition varied. Some officers continued fighting with fatalistic determination, doing their duty without hope of victory. Others embraced increasingly desperate tactics, culminating in the kamikaze attacks that characterized the war's final year. If conventional combat could not succeed, perhaps suicide attacks might achieve something. The kamikaze campaign killed thousands of American sailors and damaged or sank dozens of ships, but it could not alter the war's trajectory. American production simply replaced losses. American medical capabilities saved wounded sailors who would have died in earlier eras. American determination to achieve unconditional surrender remained unshaken. For the Americans who assembled that fleet at Ulithi, the experience was different but equally profound. The sailors and aviators who served on those carriers understood they were part of something unprecedented. The sheer scale of American naval power visible in that anchorage was something their fathers and grandfathers, veterans of World War I and earlier conflicts, could not have imagined. The United States had transformed itself from a nation with a modest peacetime military into the greatest military power in human history within 4 years. This transformation came at enormous cost, not in American casualties, though those were substantial, but in the total redirection of national effort toward war production. Civilian automobile production ceased for 3 years. Consumer goods became scarce, rationing limited access to meat, sugar, gasoline, and countless other products. Millions of men served in uniform, while millions of women took jobs in factories. The national debt increased by 500%. Every aspect of American society was bent toward winning the war. The fleet at Ulithi represented the physical manifestation of this effort. Every carrier, every destroyer, every support vessel was built by Americans who woke up each day and went to shipyards, steel mills, and factories across the nation. The aircraft on those carriers were built in plants in California, New York, and Connecticut. The fuel that powered them came from oil fields in Texas and California. The ammunition in their magazines was produced in arsenals and manufacturing facilities scattered across the continent. The food that fed the crews came from farms in the Midwest. Every element of this massive military force was supported by a logistics system that spanned a nation and crossed oceans. The strategic lesson that emerged from the Pacific War, visible in that count of 27 carriers at Ulithi, was that industrial capacity determines outcomes in modern warfare between peer or near-peer nations. Tactical excellence matters, training matters, equipment quality matters. But when nations commit fully to industrial war, production capacity becomes decisive. Japan entered the war with superior aircraft, better trained pilots, and excellent naval doctrine. The United States entered with inferior fighters, inexperienced pilots, and outdated doctrine. Within 3 years, American industry had produced so much material, and American forces had learned so quickly that Japanese advantages were negated and overwhelmed. This lesson shaped Cold War strategy and military planning for decades afterward. The emphasis on maintaining industrial capacity, on being able to mobilize and produce war material at scale, on logistics and supply chains as critical elements of military power, all derived from lessons learned in World War II. The carrier count at Ulithi was not just a tactical intelligence report. It was a demonstration of what industrial mobilization meant in practice, what total war looked like when waged by a nation with the resources and will to commit everything to victory. Commander Shibata counted 27 carriers and knew the war was over. The war continued for 9 more months, but the outcome was no longer in question. The mathematics were clear, visible there in that lagoon in the Caroline Islands. Japan had fought brilliantly in many battles. Its sailors and aviators had shown extraordinary courage. Its strategic decisions in the war's opening phase had been bold and effective. None of it mattered when confronted with the industrial power of a fully mobilized United States. The carriers at Ulithi were not just ships. They were proof that in modern industrial warfare, production capacity is destiny. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.